All right, friends, good afternoon or good morning if you're West Coast, and welcome. This is In the Movement with Sam Heath. That's me, and I'm with the Equal Justice USA Evangelical Network. And let me make sure our music won't play again. Give me 1 second. It's good to have you all here. So our goal of this webinar has always been two things. We really want to engage and we want to elevate individuals who are in the justice movement. And we're defining that pretty broadly. It's going to include things with the criminal legal system and other places and ways that that connects with other things. We really want anybody, but especially Christians, to think deeply about these things and move from a place of awareness to advocacy. And that word advocacy is really going to be poignant and important with what we're going to talk about today. And so one thing that we talk about here also is we think a lot about mass incarceration and want to engage that. But one thing that's important is to not think about mass incarceration just as a problem to be solved, but it's a symptom of other things. So we think that punishment is at the root of our criminal legal system. And under that is a fear-based response to an other, a capital O other, someone that we've wanted to remove from society for all sorts of reasons. And yet that's in conflict with so much of what we believe as Christians, especially the most repeated command in Scripture, which is do not fear. So we wanted to create and curate the space with individuals who are on the front lines doing that work, thinking through these things and on the ground loving and engaging others. So Equal Justice USA is the group that I'm with. We're a national nonprofit, and we work at the intersection of the criminal legal system, public health, and racial equity. And we want to engage death penalty repeal, things like restorative justice, and to think about what are ways of practicing community safety. And so today, our umbrella topic is Christianity and advocacy. And our guest is my friend, Michelle Ferrigno Warren. And we've known each other a couple years and engaged a lot on some deep projects. And I've really enjoyed that. So first, Michelle, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you, friend, for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for having me. I'm really grateful to be sharing this time. I do feel like I need to share that I have been waiting for like 5 hours for an inspector to come. So my greatest fear of today might be that the inspector has to come. So good news to Sam, you often have good words to share. So I may have to go off camera and mute if I have to deal with the inspector. So I just kind of want to do just a little bit of housekeeping before we really dive into a conversation that I'm incredibly passionate about, and I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk with other people like you.
Thank you. Yeah, no worries at all. There's a lot to say and a lot to think through, and head out and come back as needed. So before I give Michelle a second to introduce herself and say who she is and some of the things that she focuses on, a couple things to remember. We always record this, and what we'll do is we'll send out a YouTube link to the video so that anybody who's here and those who registered who can't come can have it. And we'll send out this as a podcast episode for you all as well. We'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if anything come up for those of you watching and listening that are here now that you want to ask or engage with, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come back to it at the end, or feel free to put it in the Q&A feature. And then we'll make sure at the end to come back and give those things some space. So before we talk through some things for context, Michelle, can you just share a little bit of who you are and what keeps you busy and some of the rhythms that you're living in right now?
Yeah, that's great. Thankfully, it's not the rhythm of frenetic. I'm doing, I'm trying to pace myself a little bit more, but I am from Denver. I'm a Denver resident. I've lived in Denver for 27 years. I really usually describe myself as a neighbor and a practitioner of Christian community development. And so that has taken on a lot of different shapes. For those of you who may have never heard of Christian community development, it is a philosophy of ministry alongside the poor. It's not the only philosophy of ministry, but it's one that I have been a part of investing deeply for the last 30 plus years. And so that's a little bit about kind of where I live. I am married. I just celebrated my 30th anniversary. I've got 3 adult kids, which is great. We're empty nesters, and my youngest is a senior in college. I am a worship leader and have been a worship pastor for many decades. And so being an artist and really expressing through song and through art is a very big part of who I am. but I also have a math degree. So I kind of have the left brain, right brain distinction, and that very logical and strategic side. Most of my time these days are really working in the confrontation of injustice and helping pastors and nonprofit leaders around the country strengthen their voice, strengthen their community voice with good strategy, technical assistance as they move their personal convictions to a very public space for the purpose of change. And I've been doing that for about 20 years. For 10 of those years, I had the opportunity, well, I've been a part of CCDA for a long time and worked with their leadership for a number of years before I decided it's time for me to leave my community full time and join the national office and build the advocacy platform for that national group. And so working with the board, working with practitioners, and really talking through what would we want, in our communities, what are we seeing and what issues do we need to confront? So did that for a while. And now I run my own consulting company. I have other people who are a part of my team, and we can mobilize fast if needed. But really, honestly, Sam, most of the work I do is long haul confrontation of injustice, reversing systemic injustice work from the community grassroots voice. And I will just say this. The power of community voice and the potential gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And I think the way that we organize and the way that we advocate and really push back when we're not being heard with faith-rooted activism is very powerful, and it does make substantive change. So I love my job, I love my community, and I love the opportunity to work with national and grassroots organizations for the power and the possibility of change.
I like that you use the word confronting injustice, which I think is it done in the right way. It can be incredible and important as we confront or come up against this thing for the sake of the other, for the sake of building up this thing that benefits all those around us. I mean, one thing I've loved in getting to know you is that this line of professional and personal is so blurred, in that a lot of this began with you thinking through, as I've learned more about you and your life story, what does it look like to be a good neighbor? And I don't just mean you, like ours did, help us, get the snow out of the driveway when there's a blizzard, but what is it, which is great, but what does it look like to really link arms with those that you're with and implant yourself with those around you? And so some of that is for you and I led to conversations about advocacy. And I'll go ahead and say this too. I've said it to you before. My favorite quote from you, and I think you said it on the Be the Bridge podcast, is that advocacy is not mission drift for the church. It is the work of the church. And so there's so many institutions and branches that we could go into with your work and your story, whether it's the criminal legal system or immigration, but all of it in a way to me is under that umbrella of what does it look like for Christians to be good neighbors, which includes being advocates in the public sphere. So part of my hope is to give those listening and who listen to this after encouragement and a sense of being emboldened to own being an advocate, and that is something that is right and righteous and good. So that's kind of a preview of where a lot of this is headed. So a couple of things to orient us. And then I think, Michelle, let's just launch into how would you talk about what it means to be an advocate? But some of those branches that I talked about, we most often in this space speak about the criminal legal system. And I always want to remind people that it's big. We have about 2 million people who are incarcerated. We have, if you add to that, about 3 million individuals who are within the system or under systems control. And that's a massive system. And again, we think that it's largely based in this fear-based response. And so there are millions of individuals within our country who are system controlled or system impacted. We can talk about the intersection that has with immigration. There's about 11 million individuals who are undocumented immigrants who live here within the United States that are our neighbors, both in a literal proximate way and in just a way that we are living in society as a whole. All of this intersects also if we talk about racial equity or inequity. We can look at some of the comparisons. I mean, there's so many statistics that we could give, but one that strikes me every time I come across, and I wanted to make sure to say it here, is paralleling that median net worth of a Black household, which is $24,000, with a white household, which is $189,000. There are a lot of statistics that we could use to show some of those inequities, but that's one that it's inarguable that that's real. But what led to it is where I think a lot of rich discussion can get to. So I name all of those institutions and facets of our society just all under that umbrella of faith-rooted activism, which is a phrase I know you've used and others use. So let's kind of start there, because you and I met initially in an activist space. And so what is faith-rooted activism?
Yeah, so I would say under the entire banner of the work of peace. MLK is very famously quoted as, peace is not the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice.
Mhm.
And as Christians who follow Christ and just the heart of who God is, I've heard it that justice is to the Old Testament as love is to the New Testament. It is central. It is sort of the blood that pumps through the veins. That's a very human analogy when you think of God, but that is the essence of who he is a God of justice. And justice demands not just an individual restoration, but a restoration and health of the whole. So I share that within peacemaking because Christ says, he's the peace, he's the Prince of
Mhm.
Peace. And that was sort of the prophetic, he is coming. And then he says, my peace I leave with you, that not the way the peace that the world would offer it, but, just to be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. He invites us to join him in this work of what God has been doing since day one, pushing out darkness with light, and to join him in being the light of the world, to overcome darkness with light, to overcome evil with good. And it's these active agents of work that we do that fit under the banner of peacemaking. That's being a neighbor, being honest about what's going on. You've shared statistics, and Zach, I saw that. I'm not really that great at paying attention to the chats, but something you've shared is very near and dear to my heart. We have thousands of Venezuelan migrants who have been coming to Denver alone, and they're in my church, and they're, the shelter is just a couple blocks from my community. And that has been a really important thing that's happening. But when we look at that as Christians, we're not just looking at statistics. We're not just looking at social issues or social concerns. We're trying to figure out how to be neighbors, how to be people in the world, and to be honest that maybe things aren't so shiny and happy. Right. And a peacemaker is willing to see the evil, hear the evil, speak the evil, and not run the other way, but walk towards it. So I share that because that's an important piece to explain what I mean by faith-rooted activism. For me, my awareness that moved to an action in solidarity started with what I saw and how I thought. It moved to my heart, right? Because these are my neighbors. This is my community. How could I not join alongside them in the work of their liberation, which became my shared liberation, right? So as I'm walking with them and moving my head and my heart, you actually are asked to use your body. And taking what you're thinking, or some people are learning on things on Facebook or learning things in the news, and it's starting to take shape. They're starting to bridge their awareness and ask questions of, what am I supposed to do with the pain of the world? What am I supposed to do as a Christian with the pain of this world? And there's a lot of conversations around deconstruction, and there's a lot of disillusionment, and that could be this, but also a separate podcast. This is really more about, how do I lean in? And faith rooted just shows that what I do in my leaning in, whether it is secular or sacred, I am rooted to my deep Christian faith. I'm unapologetically and overtly rooted to that Christian faith, but I also know that the work I do in my community is not always rooted to the same faith. So when I move my body and my convictions and do whatever we need to do on behalf of justice, activism is this start with the head, move to the heart, full body movement forward. And one of the chapters in my new book, Join the Resistance, is actually called Falling Forward. It's chapter 3. It's with Fannie Lou Hamer. I know I actually have a copy of
Oh,
my
good.
book.
I wanted to make sure.
I
I didn't
got
know if
both
you
of
would show
them.
it.
I got both of them. And I couldn't remember if we were talking
Good.
about
I'm glad
Join
you talked about it. I was if you weren't.
Yeah, I was doing an event just 2 hours ago on my book. And so I was like, oh, good, I'm still primed, ready to go. But that third chapter is actually about, I'm there, I can't go back. I'm too deep in. It's almost like Peter coming to Jesus, kind of sharing what he's seeing. And Jesus is like, basically, you can leave at any time. He's like, I have no place to go.
Right.
And that's the level of neighboring and confronting, not for the sake of, just blowing things up.
Right.
Although, I won't talk about that being so negative, but anyway, just it's more that I have no place to go,
Yeah.
not because I sure don't fit into an old spot. It's just I am compelled to believe that this kingdom that we pray that is in heaven would be here on earth, that daily bread, which is right after those, in that 57 words of that Lord's Prayer. God, will you bring your kingdom on earth like it is in heaven? Give us the daily bread. So it's that
Right.
whole body recognition that whatever we need to do to move forward, I'm not worried about, oh, wow, should a white woman do this? Oh, wow, should a woman do this? Oh, wow, should an evangelical do this? Oh, wow, should a former, grew up in one of the wealthiest counties, Republican, conservative, Christian school. I mean, there's no more lines anymore.
Mm.
Whatever we need to do together that is, shrewd and wise and, peaceful and winsome. Like I don't do everything, obviously not legal things, but,
Mhm, mhm.
there's a lot we can talk about with nonviolent civil disobedience and how Martin Luther King Jr. actually came to that same realization that, I've got to do whatever I can. And that includes using my body. And so
Right.
that's what I mean by faith rooted activism. There's no line that I will not cross. Now there's activities I might not, I might
Mhm.
put in check, but I don't ever use an excuse like, oh, wow, I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, except if we go there. No, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's different than just activism, which is a broader thing. I mean, you're talking about something that is rooted in Christian faith and that flows from that. And there's only about 17 directions we could go after all that you just said, which is a great thing. So one thread to pick up on is you talking about deconstruction. And I was just listening to Russell Moore on a podcast this morning, talking with Mike Cosper about Russell's new book. And one thing that Russell Moore said was, the biggest mistake or biggest misconception about deconstruction is thinking that that's all that you should do. You should just deconstruct and leave it. He said real deconstruction ends with something else being reconstructed. And deconstruction in and of its own, whether it's of your faith or whatever, is not bad, is not an inherently wrong thing. What matters is where we end. And so I hear an echo of that and what you're saying about justice, that justice is confronting evil and stopping evil or stopping state violence or whatever it is. But it's also this presence, this embodied presence of building something else too. And some of the deepest definitions of abolition, if we're talking about that, get at that. It's not just a removal of something, but it's a presence, right? To seek the welfare of the city. It is an embodied presence that's there. And that, I think, is one of the most unique things about faith-rooted activism is, like you're saying, it's motivated by these things and it leads Christians into unique places that others wouldn't go or wouldn't go for the same reasons.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts. One, I want to talk about the prophet Amos, but before I do
Mm,
that, I'm a mathematician. That's what my undergraduate is in. And I share that because philosophy and math are built on the same logic model. So, Russell Moore is an ethicist, he's in that philosophy camp. I'm in, sort of the hard sciences of that same, it's like I said, it's exact same type of thinking. And any mathematician or philosopher knows that logic models are built in deconstruction. So when people are deconstructing and pulling away what they perceived as right or true or good, that's actually a very high level of thinking. It is a
mhm,
good thing, but it is not true thinking and it's not sincere if we don't pull it apart for the purpose of rebuilding what is true. And
mhm,
what I often tell people is make sure in your deconstruction, you do the work of trying to construct yourself to something. Because if you are deconstructed and untethered to anything,
mm,
this world is very windy and, hurricanes and tsunamis, you will just be lost.
yeah,
And so the good thinking and the good philosophical, logical work requires that you have to believe in something and you
right.
have to begin. I've done, you usually go through periods of deconstruction, sometimes 3 and 4 times in your life, significant periods. I've decided as a woman, as a, 50 something year old woman, I've done it more. Men, I think women do it more than men. And I think that's like the gift of being a woman. But that whole point is that you have to be free. And for those of us who follow the one who called himself the truth
Mhm,
and the way and the life. There's a lot of security in that deconstruction because truth will set us free.
Mm,
And it is that rebuilding. So that's one thing. And then I think another thing that you shared, it just reminds me of the prophet Amos.
mhm.
So, I don't want to get into one of the things in my most recent book is every chapter I highlight a work of the prophet. And I do that because I do agree, and I'll say it over and over again, and you've already mentioned it, kind of repeating my words, that advocacy is not mission drift for the church. It is the work of the church. So you feel
Mhm.
like that Christ came as prophet, priest, and king.
Right.
And there are three distinct roles that he embodied. And we may not all embody all three, but we at least have to acknowledge the presence and the need of all. And even Paul said, when you're looking at gifting, pray for the gift of prophecy, that truth telling. Of course, there's a foretelling and a forthtelling, but when I'm talking about, that prophetic work of the church, I'm talking about that liberating work of honesty and truth telling and working towards repair. So I do believe that advocacy is not mission drift to the church. I think it's the prophetic work, and it can be the prophetic word from the church for every single moment in history. And what I try to do is explain that we are not just coming into an awareness like, oh, wow, this has never happened before. And we've shown up and made it all about ourselves because
Mm,
now we know the death penalty needs to be eradicated, or now we know that Venezuelan migrants are coming here. That's a good awareness point. But it is
mhm.
important for us in our Micah, do justice, love mercy, to actually begin with walking humbly,
Yeah.
because it's a
Yeah.
humble realization that we have inherited a
Right.
lineage and legacy of this prophetic work that we need to look back so that we can ground ourselves in the present and move forward. So Amos. So
Mm,
Amos, it's interesting because there are a lot of secular activist groups that will say stuff that, oh, that justice would roll down like
right.
a righteousness, like a never ending stream. And they don't understand even that it's from the Bible.
Right. They think it just
Or
came from Martin King.
that's right. Well, and
Yeah.
you know what? We're grateful for Dr. King and all of the ways that he lifted up scripture, the
Mhm.
power of the gospel, the commitment to shared liberation. I mean, we are a richer church because of it. They killed him for that because he was a prophet at that time. And at that point, I wrote an article this past year on the anniversary of Letters from Birmingham Jail for Christianity Today to really
Mhm.
talk about a lot of his work. But anyway, Amos, he is very well known, of course, for that particular exclamation, oh, that could be the status quo. When I read it, I'm like, oh, that the status quo could be this ease of justice and righteousness. So we know it's not that case, right? And we can talk a little bit more about it. But before that particular passage in Amos, Amos also shares that during his time, he's just like, things are going on that are unjust, and the prudent man keeps silent. He was not saying this was a complimentary thing, but it's like, it's so bad and people can see it, but it's not safe. So they keep quiet. And I think that's why I continue to try to exhort the church to open up our mouths and not to remain quiet.
Mhm.
Because while it may be prudent to keep your friends, may be prudent to keep your privilege, people are dying, and we must do everything we can to join them and together seek liberation and justice so
Mhm.
that everyone can benefit from goodness, the justice and righteousness. And then that would be, oh, that
Mhm.
would be the river and the status quo.
Mhm. I want people to know that, Michelle, this is so often how our conversations go, that this is a good representation of you and I talking and both
No
having
kidding.
having a lot to say and pushing back and pulling and going down these threads. And we could do this for several hours. This is it's
I
just
think
a,
we already have. We just recorded it and invited other people.
there it is. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad. So you talked about that idea of being untethered. And it makes me think about the play and the movie Doubt by John Patrick Shanley that
I have
came
not
out several
watched it.
years ago.
You tell me a little bit.
It's an incredible story. It centers around four people on the stage. The movie was great, all of those things. But at the core, what that play was wanting someone to do was to have doubt and question. It was in the context of a Catholic school in the 1960s and having doubt and wondering about all of these things. And it's an incredible work of art. But the thing that always unsettled me is at the end, it ends by just leaving someone in this place of questioning and not having a way forward. And when you talked about even in the deconstruction process, still needing to be tethered because this world will sweep you up or blow you away, it's crucial or critical. And again, I think that word that you had about being tethered, even amidst that process, is so key and makes me think about that play and kind of the thing again that unsettled me with it of doubt is incredible and important and good, but it's not an end point. It's something that's on the way towards something else, even if we're not sure what that is. But that deconstruction piece is huge. And to do that, like you're saying, with a humble and a teachable spirit, which unfortunately doesn't characterize some of the harder and worst parts of evangelicals' history. I've also heard you say before, and I love this, that as much as maybe parts of evangelicalism want to kick Michelle Warren out, you want to hold on to it because it's important to you as an identity marker. Say why. Like, why is being an evangelical or what that label means to you? Why is that really important? Because some people say, we just need to throw that out because it's only bad, only evil all the time. What is this, Judges? So why is that not the case for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of a decision. It's a form of resistance myself. There's sort of the evangelical moniker that people use within politics, that people there's an evangelical culture and there's an evangelical theology. I'm not entirely sure the evangelical culture knows the evangelical theology. And so I don't want to deny the truth of who I am. I am evangelical in my theology. And because of my theology, it drives a practice of being a neighbor. And that's a very powerful word when you know scripture and you know the command that, the second command is to love your neighbor as yourself. And when Jesus is kind of sharing that, he actually talks about the story of the Good Samaritan and begins to weave a story of what it can look like. And, I see Zach's question. I think we should definitely address it at some point around the road, and just how the parable of the Good Samaritan can move us from just the loving mercy to the doing justice and having that discipleship. But for me, I mean, I'm not going to die for the word evangelical. I'm just not going to run away from it and pretend that my theology, and I believe, the Bible, I believe Jesus is who he said he is. I do believe it is good news even for the poor. I don't think we get it right a lot. And one of the reasons I've resisted that, I have a friend, I think I told you that story, and it was right after the 2016 election, and he and I both had, took up some space in the same place, both white, both evangelicals, both working and living and worshiping in communities that were, predominantly people of color impacted by economic and racial injustice. And he called me and he said, are you going to keep calling yourself an evangelical? And I think I had some actually choice words and said, I'll just say it a nice way. I just said, oh, yes, of course. But I told him, and he's like, are you kidding? I thought for sure, like he was looking for permission. He's like, I thought for sure you'd be. I was like, no. I was like, they've been trying to kick me out of the club for years. I'm a girl. Like nobody wants me there anyway. I'm the big bummer, that I just won't just sit there. I mean, it's a bummer. I've walked in the door and I'm sitting at the table, as equals and, speaking about theological issues and preaching, at that point I was preaching in mainline churches because evangelicals at that, wouldn't let me in. I mean, that's not true at that time, but that was sort of the beginning. So I think it's my evangelical theology that I'm not going to hide it and pretend, because I think evangelical culture has really gotten it so wrong from, and I don't just say that flippantly. I'm just not throwing words around. This isn't the time and place, but I can walk us through the entire book of Isaiah on how I think that we have gotten it so wrong as a culture, that the fact that our theology and culture are so separated, I think that's what, a lot of the prophets, especially Isaiah, was railing on. You are so content with your spiritual piety, your religious acts, but it's not representative of the theological heart of God and who he is. And so the culture, you're going to be punished for your culture. And then stamping God on it. So I just think those are some of those sort of whoa moments. So I'm not going to lift up the banner of I'm dying for the evangelical, but I'm just saying I'm not leaving the table. I'm not pretending that's not who I am in my theology,
Right.
because I think that is true and good and right. My praxis is representative of my theology, and sometimes evangelical culture really doesn't understand that, and that is a shame.
Yeah. But it's such a key distinction between the theology versus the culture in lots of spaces, but especially with evangelical. I've heard Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, say before, I can take or leave the term evangelical, but yet what that stands for, the theology that's there, that's what's key. And so it's not about just an identity or a term. I hear you saying that it is this theology that centers around this love of Scripture, this knowledge and belief of who Jesus is. And I think evangelicals often forget this. Activism or living out of your faith has always been part of evangelicalism. It's shifted where it's been applied, but it's not out of line to say a tenet of evangelicalism is to engage culture and those around us. And you've talked about the idea of neighbor, and even Jesus, when he was asked, who is my neighbor? His answer was the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so I love that Jesus is saying your neighbor is not just the person that you live beside, but your neighbor is the person that you encounter who has need. And that is determinant of who it is that Christians can then go and love. So with that, tell us some about where you live and why you live there and how you have worked to live out an embeddedness of loving a neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably my husband and I chose to work and worship in a community impacted by racial and economic injustice. We just didn't want to commute. And so we just lived there as well. And we don't, our whole 30 years has not been, okay, well, we're going to live here, but we're going to go to a church to a different place, or we're going to farm our kids off to different youth groups, or have them attend schools. Like that has just been an embodying and shared solidarity in community. And I know I mean, that is pretty extreme. And I don't know if I didn't follow anybody else into that practice. It was definitely a stepping into, because we just believed that that's where we were supposed to be. And so 30 years of living in Section 8 housing, and we haven't lived there the whole time, but some of our journey, Section 8 housing and the all African American community, teaching at the local middle school, starting and then living with our family in a transitional home for homeless teen girls, for moving out. We moved out, of course we didn't go far. We have been a part of Open Door Fellowship and started Open Door Ministries, a community development corporation that, honestly, if anybody had known what it was going to be, would never have let a 25 and 26-year-old start it. But it was really just dreaming together of what we as a community could do, and our family was a part of it. We didn't do it as some type of social experiment, and we didn't do it sort of as a distinction, like, well, look at us, this is what we're doing. This was just a part of the work, was our presence. But I do understand that it is really important to get as close as you can in order to join that collective work. So I often will say things: you cannot fix problems you don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking from afar, whether it's trafficking or, any social concern, hunger, healthcare, we make a lot of ideas and judgments about things from afar off.
Mm-hmm.
And then we project ideas or just a lot of emotion on why we should or shouldn't solve those problems. And I just really think that proximity is really, really important, which is why I wrote that first book, The Power of Proximity, because I need it. If you're not going to understand how to be a part of a solution from a distance, then becoming proximate is the only way to join in that collection. So yeah. So like I said, it wasn't a social experiment, but it is really unique to have lived, to work, and to worship. And that's important, because a lot of times that segregated hour, we went to a church where we were unique. We were not the norm. And it didn't matter. And it didn't really feel weird after a while. It was a very different decision, but it made all the difference. People ask me how I ended up with 2 of my 3 kids being lawyers. I'm just like, well, if all you are is upfront and close and personal with the pain and the injustice of people, of course you're going to be a lawyer. We need justice. Lawyers are not like the bad guys in the community, or like trying to, maybe not in our community, we can't find one, like you just like are in search of them. And even if you could find one, they're out of reach for, to pay them. So, they're good news for a community that's in need of justice.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's a little bit of who we are. It's just who we are. I don't even think about it. It's been 30 years.
the good news is that there's been so much discussion and writing and highlighting of that way of living, at least in the last several years. I mean, one, the way that you're describing, in some sense, is just a biblical way of living. We want to engage those who have need, and we want to love our neighbor. And it just seems logical that that would mean a presence or a proximity with them. But to your point, that's been radical for a while. And it's part of why I'm so thankful for the Christian Community Development Association of calling others to have that be a rhythm of life, so that it's not as radical as unfortunately it has been.
Yeah, I want to interject this because there are a lot of economic pushes and pulls, especially in housing and affordability, that it's not a flippant decision. And so just moving into a community and beginning to drive up, there's a lot of fixer-upper kinds of things, we're
Right.
watching real estate go up. That is very different. In the CCD philosophy, it was started with like three: reconciliation, redistribution, and oh my goodness, I can't even
And
remember.
redistribute,
Oh,
reconcile,
relocation,
and
relocation. Sorry, we're talking about
relocation.
relocation.
That's what we're
Yeah,
talking about.
I was going to say that's what we're talking about. So you have these things. If you have relocation without the principles of redistribution
Mm-hmm.
and reconciliation, that's just gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just where you place yourself, it's how you place yourself in a posture of neighboring, in a posture of peacemaking. And the problem is it takes a really long time for people who look like me, that come
Mm-hmm.
from my background and your background too,
Yeah.
to get over the white savior piece.
Right.
And we may even know it in the language and say, oh, I don't want to be that person. But it is really a complete reversing of the way that we have been programmed to look at the world. That's the whole idea of white supremacy. We just have been I remember having a conversation, two different conversations. One, I was with a group of leaders in Denver. This is a long time ago. I mean, like really long time ago. And we were having a very vulnerable conversation. I think I was the only white person. And I kind of got up the courage to say, well, we've been taught to think we're better than you. Now, it was not one of these conversations like, I think I am. We were just having a very honest conversation, talking about sort of the barriers.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that, and they all laughed, like, we already know that. I was like, okay, because I was afraid to say it out loud. You're like, well, we know that.
Yeah.
And I've had meetings, those kind of one, I remember some intimate meetings where I was just like, you guys know we've been taught to believe that we're better than other people. We might not say, oh, we're than people of color, or, poor people, but we work. And that's the whole idea of sort of this superiority, the
Mm-hmm.
supremacy. And when you put it along race and class and sometimes even gender identity, that is the whole human hierarchy. That is the curse of Genesis 3 that we all have been liberated from through Christ's work. And, we are not, as Christians, to be living in a post-fall, pre-Pentecost narrative. We're supposed to be embarking, on what Paul was so frustrated in Galatians, like, you foolish people, don't you understand there's no human hierarchy? There's no difference between. So if there's no difference between, then I shouldn't be speeding up my step when I'm
Mm-hmm.
walking along the life's Jericho road. When I decide to visit it, and for the week of my missions trip, or the weekly, tutoring that I do, we are thankful. I mean, I'm about real estate on the Jericho road. That's a
Mm-hmm.
part of my story.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
not that people can't come in. It's just that unless you come in a certain posture,
Mm-hmm.
you actually will do harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to take that relocation principle and ensure that not only the posture of humility, but truly understand what is reconciliation, what is racial justice, what is redistribution, what is systemic, repair, because without that, then you have white saviorism and or gentrification.
Right. And you miss out on being helped and changed yourself too. I mean, that's what's so important about being a neighbor. It's bi-directional. It's not just one person coming in and always giving and always offering. I mean, we think of a marriage like it is something that is mutual, and that there's giving and teaching and taking and learning and all of those things that work together.
Yeah, I
You,
usually say the word reciprocity of relationship.
yeah.
Yeah, remember I was preaching, I think it was almost 15, 20 years ago now. And I was preaching on, they gave me what I was supposed to be speaking on. It was in Romans 12. It was the part, sort of the end of Romans 12, where Paul's talking about the gifts and how we're supposed to steward it in the church. And then he says, don't be proud, don't be conceited, be willing to associate with people of low position, and talks about
Mm,
never lacking in zeal. So I would just say that I don't think Paul went far enough. I mean, don't be proud, don't be don't be I forgot, don't be proud, don't be, what did I just say it was? Regardless, but I would say be willing to be the person of low position. And I'm not talking about a false humility. I'm not talking about a false need. The gift of being here this many decades is you can't hold it together. There's two cardinal rules to being white. You can't be broken. You can't be broken. And so we have been in our culture trained to hold it together.
Yeah.
And so when you live here, you get sick. And I don't like get colds, but I have some really chronic illness issues. And like, there are days that I have to use my flange crutches because my arthritis, and I've had some crippling, and it's not normally the story I talk about, but my neighbors know it and my community knows it. And they've watched me, a couple of years ago, I went into anaphylaxis and multi-organ failure and muscle leak. So like your whole community comes in and, just cheering me on as I'm trying to walk with my walker, trying to make it a few more steps, trying to get to the end of the block, those are the kinds of things that the reciprocity, be willing to be the person of low position, be willing to hang out with each other, be willing to see yourself as shared humanity with the rights and privileges that everyone should have access to. And it's that level of relationship and reciprocity that really, you said that my life was like blurred all together between, work and yeah, of course, there's no lines.
Yeah. And that's goes with the territory in a good way.
In a great way.
You talk about in The Power of Proximity that you say awareness is not enough to fix a broken system. You talk about in Psalm 89, justice being part of God's throne. And you talk about Martin Luther King saying, we also have to eventually fix the road. And so I want to give a nod to the question that came in of how is it that we balance this individual engagement and engaging that person on a personal level while also holding with that, addressing these systemic needs? Or how do we engage the individual and the institutional at the same time?
Yeah, I would say we always have to leave the posture and the openness for holistic restoration. Not everybody is going to be in the same place. Like I didn't walk into my neighborhood knowing what I know. That's part of the reason I wrote The Power of Proximity. I wrote a book I wish somebody had handed to me as a 22-year-old. That doesn't mean it's just for 22-year-olds, but I actually have met young people who are like, wow, this is what I needed. So I wrote that book because you should be able to go a little bit farther along than someone like me in the late 80s and early 90s when Christian Community Development, the association, you couldn't get a nonprofit degree back then. You didn't even know what community development is, much less Christian community development. So, I mean, you have to be responsible in your work to help train and equip people who have come behind you. So I wrote that book with that idea in mind, that you have to move it. So I would just say a couple of things there. First of all, I want to talk about the Good Samaritan and use that allegory or that parable to kind of answer Zach's question. But I want us to understand that this is a journey that we cannot anticipate around the corner, that we need, and it's a faith journey, but it is a committed setting a vision of what can be and walking it with resolve by faith, knowing that the cloud of witnesses is gone before us and that there will be people after us. That is important because we won't be able to get from mercy to justice to, act in a minute. We just aren't going to. And people are not going to get there in a minute as well. This is a process, but it is a commitment to the deep level of discipleship that Christians are to do in the world. So you have to know a few things. Righteousness, tzedakah, the Old Testament word of righteousness, is not actually about individual piety. It's not about attending a service or doing, Bible reading. These are all good things. Prayer. Righteousness actually is about right acts toward. It's always an outward expression. So when we see that word righteousness, that metaphor, it's this right act going towards someone. The reason they're together is because it becomes mishpat. It becomes justice when we as Christians are working our right acts toward. So that's just an important thing to understand as we begin to navigate a maturation of our Christian discipleship. Proclamation and discipleship is a really important piece, but discipleship is beyond our individual righteousness, and it moves and compels us towards what love looks like
Mhm.
on the Jericho Road, in public,
Mhm.
etc. So I'll go to that Jericho Road because in chapter 2 of the Power of Proximity, I try to lay out. I mean, I'm a teacher. You and I've talked about this too, Sam. Once a teacher, always a teacher.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
just want to make it as simple as possible that here we have agape love. Jesus is having a conversation with a young punk lawyer. I already told you I have a couple lawyers, understand, sort of challenging him, trying to catch him. And what's the greatest commandment? And of course, he answers it for Jesus. Love your neighbor. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And then he explains, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we have 4 different people in this story that are along this road. And a lot is happening. Another thing, mercy is a response to a problem. We're
Mm.
supposed to love mercy. We're supposed to never get tired of mercy. I'm going to be honest. 30 years, 30 plus years in, I died of giving a fish. But you know what? I'm
Mhm.
supposed to love it. I'm supposed to love it, love it, love it. And not just, I'm not supposed to love mercy of the poor. I'm supposed to love the family and the community and the background that I came from, and forgive without question. And, like that's just a hard posture, but that's the posture of the command, right? So here I
Mhm.
am to be love mercy. So you've got a person on this Jericho road. He's probably dumb. Like who doesn't travel in a caravan? The Jericho Road is the most, scared. Oh, everybody knows about the Jericho Road at the time of this storytelling because pretty much everyone's gone because it's the road to get you to Jerusalem. And so we all know it is dangerous in our Jericho Road in this day and age. What neighborhoods, what places do we avoid at what times? And for sure, you're going to lock your door, and it's for sure your car's not going to be low on gas. And, so this guy's walking alone, not a smart move, but he falls prey to being beaten up and robbed and left for half dead. So we got half dead, beaten up man on the side of the road. Then the next 2 people that come through are the Levites and priests that we learn are walking quickly by. So they are obviously not peacemakers. They are not willing to see what's going on. They don't want
Slow
to hear.
down.
Yeah, they won't hear it. They're not going to
Mhm.
say, "Hey, are you okay?" and even walk. They're going to pretend, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and I'm just going to leave it. So not even going to respond to a mercy problem. Then you've got the 4th person who literally is the neighbor. He's the person that God wants us to be. And so it's on that Jericho Road that we are given the invitation to give a meal. So, Zach, I'm kind of addressing your question. I'm able to practice what Isaiah 58 talks about in the kind of fast that God asks of us in a sacrifice and liberating people and their physical needs. It's what the parable of the sheep and the goats really explains in Matthew 25. It's how James beckons us to show us your faith by your works to look after vulnerable people. So I'm responding to with a meal, with clothes, with shelter. That's a good response. It's not enough to ensure that everybody has justice, but that's a part of our discipleship. And
Mhm.
when we begin to become aware of the person on the side of the road, much like the Samaritan, and then we move from our awareness to learning more and to engaging that person. So you watch the Samaritan in the parable not only bind up his wounds, but take him, put some money, and say, "I'm going to come back for it." If you continue to live and serve and acknowledge the Jericho Road, then you will begin to realize that there's no reason for anyone to be perpetually beaten up and left half for dead. So you start to think about, okay, how can we do citizen watch groups? We're going to walk together. That's more of a
Mhm.
justice response so people don't get into it. Another merciful response could be we're going to put a clinic at the end of the Jericho Road so that the Good Samaritan has places to drop him off. Again,
Mhm.
mercy. We just have to continue to ask hard questions and recognize that, and that's the deconstruction. Ask
Mhm.
those hard questions, challenge the truth of who Jesus is, the truth of the power of his spirit, and the equipment that he's given us to meet what we are seeing along the Jericho Road, and not give up or become cynical, but begin to think bigger and deeper and wider. How can we get better lighting on the Jericho Road so that people, like I said, people can walk together? There's certain times of safety safety. And then you just realize, there's no reason not to fix the road. And that gets into the individual restoration, the social restoration, the systemic restoration. And for those of us who may be disillusioned or frustrated with the people who are giving meals, that is the beginning of loving mercy. That is not doing justice, it's mercy. And we're supposed to love it, but let's keep growing towards from a relief to a development response. And as I shared before, rights to the pond, systemic barriers. You could be doing all these great things, but until you acknowledge that there is a system that has intentionally written people out, and that if we don't reverse it, we will always have a road that perpetually beats up and robs and leaves people for half dead. And that should keep us awake and motivated at night to do the good work of kingdom justice.
What do you say to people who hear that and might say, this is just too political. Let's just love Jesus. It's just about the gospel.
I would say it's not political, it's hard. I think that is a deflection. That's also saying, Sam, you're just a liberal. Why should I listen to you? It's a version of cancel. And we don't see that. There is nothing theological to back up what is being said in that way, which is why I try to be so theological in my books, is to really point that from beginning to the end of the Bible, caring about, the restoration of all things, of what was broken, and the human hierarchy and the disconnection from God and the disconnection between creation and not just God, but each other, etc. All that frustration in the world has been promised a Christ that will meet us and bind up the brokenhearted, and it is beyond the spiritual. So I am a mother of 3 kids. You have a couple kids. I do want my kids to have not only a spiritual awakening, but a relationship with the person I believe, the God person I believe is the way, the truth, and the life, right? I want my kids to know Jesus. I don't want them just to experience sort of a salvation conversion. I want them to walk with the Holy Spirit, be deeply rooted so that his fruit is evidenced in their life. That's what I want for my children. But I would be a horrible parent if I said, I'm not going to worry about feeding them, not going to worry about taking them to school. I don't care about their mental or their emotional well-being. I'm just caring about Jesus. Why can't we just care about salvation and pine our way to glory? I think that is immature and it is not holistic. There is nothing that I see in scripture, and I probably would go toe to toe. I'm not a big debater, not my favorite thing, but I would, because I don't see anything that is through the word of God and the witness of Jesus Christ and his call from the chosen people of the Old Testament to the called out ecclesia of the New Testament in this kingdom age that could back up that statement.
You said enjoying the resistance. It might have been the first sentence. Injustice does not just happen, and it does not repair itself. And there's so many echoes of that in what you're just saying, that we have to recognize where injustice comes from. Because if we start seeing that, then we're going to see that it's going to require our engagement with it, because it's not going to just undo itself. Yes, Christ will come and right all things, but on the way to that, we are called to live in a certain way. And that means engaging things in people and systems holistically, because it's not just going to repair itself.
Yeah, this is a really great month to be having some of this conversation on the work of repair, because this is August, and in the United States, August, I've always thought of August as a really powerful month, as a practitioner, as a neighbor, as a person who wants to right the wrongs alongside a community. August is August recess. So at CCDA, we started we put together toolkits. Christina's doing a great job in putting that forward today. It's not the only time, but it's a really important time that 535 leaders are supposed to be representing us and representing a justice and liberty for everyone are actually home in their districts. And so learning who your people are and getting them to know who you are and beginning to realize, voting is important. It's also the lowest level of civic engagement. So thank you for picking the apple that is close without even standing on your tippy toes. But let's keep going up the tree and beginning to understand it's not government that should give us reason to hope. It's the power of the people of God doing the work of justice and peacemaking that should give us hope. And this is a really great month to learn about and how to equip ourselves to be active agents of change. I don't want anybody to ever quit their day job. Sam, like that is like something, if I could write like the most practical book on, excuse me, how to do the work of activism and advocacy, taking your personal convictions to a more public place, the title would be Don't Quit Your Day Job. Like everyday practices for the people of God, for the work in the world. I don't want people to move. Honestly, living in my community is not so helpful. I need to actually, go back to where I came from. In my family home, my parents live on the 18th hole of the Highlands Ranch Golf Course, which is in Douglas County, which is the third wealthiest county in the country. It is, there's plenty of red politicians. I mean, there's a lot of influence that, a lot of times I gotta go back to where I came from to even find people, to even talk about mass incarceration, to even talk about death penalty or immigration, because they just aren't on the road. They're not on the road. They don't know. I don't really think, I don't think actually, it's not been my experience that Christians or privileged Christians from higher economic status communities like have animosity. They just don't know. And if you don't know, you can't care. And so there is a role that for the person like my mom, who every week went in and tutored for years, the same girl, stayed in a relationship with that young woman until she graduated from high school, helped her get enrolled in community college, has been there and met her babies and her husband. Like that once a week proximity not only radically changed my mom, but radically changed that woman and her life, not in every way, shape, or form, but in a very significant way. So it's all of these choices to get off the road of comfort, to get off the road of privilege and join to see what can I do and how can I learn. The idea of a neighbor just being next to you is very Western in thought. It is also not Old Testament in thought. When Jesus is talking about neighbors, it's like pretty much just a nice way of saying lots of people. Everybody in your world, like you need to care. And even if you want to argue about what a neighbor is and what culture it was written, it's fine. I don't have time for that. But I do understand the picture of the body of Christ, and that when one part suffers, we all suffer. I don't think we're all suffering. Okay. I think we are denying that we even need the poor part of the body of Christ, or the people of color part, or, the Venezuelan migrant part. People know Jesus. They're coming here. That's who they invoke to come. Not everyone, but a lot of our family in the body of Christ, we have completely decided that we don't need them. And that is why Jesus, I think, still talks to the Father and prays that we would be one like they are one. And until we have that and that shared concern, we just aren't going to get it right. We need to work to ensure that we care beyond our own individual desires and satisfaction.
Let me end with this. One, let me read, if you don't mind. This will make me self-conscious.
Of course, I want you to read
the conclusion of Join the Resistance.
Let me just say this. Let me just say this. I appreciate you doing that. But Zach, and anybody else, all of you participants, I have written that I'm a storyteller and a story writer. So my books are filled with stories. Okay. And so if you want to hear stories, you just, it's not going to take much to find them. That, like I said, that I'm a teacher. I already know you're bored by statistics. So I put everything couched in story, because most of my audience are millennials, and millennials love stories, but we as humans love stories. So it's in there, and I would just encourage you. I have a website, you can find things out, and I really want to be a part of helping disciple the church in this type of formation, this level of formation for, the work in the public square. So I'll just let you read, but wanted to share that.
Well, you said this, that you have a website, and if people have come before, they know. Anybody who's registered, of course, all those who are here, I'll send out links to all these things that Michelle and I have talked about, to the books, to her website, to the Christianity Today article, Michelle, that you wrote. I would love for people to see that. So let me end by reading this, and then I'll point or give a nod towards next month's webinar. But you say at the very end, you say, someday justice will roll down like a river. Until then, we have what we need to resist. Together, we must join to work toward the collective good. Those of us who benefit from the status quo must not only cross over and serve the movement, stay at the table, and help our people. We must, as instruments of peace, do so rooted in joy. So, one, Michelle, thank you for coming and sharing of your life and your work and all of these things that have shaped you. I love our conversations and I'm so thankful for our friendship, and joke with my wife often when I talk about you of saying, man, once we found out what each other's Enneagrams were, we really hit it off because then we knew how to engage each other. So I'm so grateful for you each time that we get to talk. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So next month, we're going to be back as we always are, and I'll put in the chat and in the email to everybody the link to register for that. But it's going to be Wednesday, September 6th, and we're going to be talking with two individuals who are with FADP, or Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And we're going to look at Florida as a case study of what's happening with the death penalty movement nationally, why, how, and should Christians engage death penalty repeal or death penalty moratorium work, and some of the unique things and difficult things that are happening down in Florida as you have individuals in a group working towards a very specific goal, which is the end of the death penalty there. And again, why, how, and should Christians care about and engage that work, not just in Florida, but nationally or in the other 22 remaining states besides Florida that still have the death penalty. So we'll think about those things and talk with two individuals from that group. But again, I'll send you all links to the things that Michelle mentioned. Michelle, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to everybody who's here, and blessings on your day. Bye-bye.